Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Before we begin this topic, and this is really fitting with the theme of metaphysical challenges, this is a serious metaphysical challenge. It had a very personal side to it for me, which I'll share with you. But I just wanted to first give a shout out and a thank you to my brother, Dr. Stuart Apfel. He's a neurologist. A lot of the content that we'll be discussing, I gained from conversations with him and Shiurim that I heard from him. This is really a very serious topic for him, but the advantage of being a neurologist, you'll see, as it relates to some of the discussion. So everyone who has the handout, I wanted to just point out that Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, in almost like a Navi, anticipated this issue in his commentary on last week's parsha, on Parshas V'Eschanan. Very famous, "V'nishmartem ma'od lanafshosecha." So most of us are familiar with that mitzvah, "V'nishmartem ma'od lanafshosecha," as it applies to the chiyuv we have to take good care of ourselves, to make sure that we're listening to our doctor's advice, eating healthy and having healthy habits. Not doing dangerous things, not putting ourselves b'sakana. Rav Hirsch had a very literal and fascinating, different approach to what unishmartem ma'od lanafshosechem is. Basically, he understood it as having an agenda to be a very key element in being machazik our emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Unishmartem ma'od lanafshosechem. If you literally guard your neshama, guard your soul, says Rav Hirsch, the following. Besides God, there is only one other being of whose individual reality and personal existence, although invisible and unable to be realized by any of our physical senses, each one of us bears within himself the direct certainty of conviction that that is our soul, our nefesh, right? His assumption, Rav Hirsch, that all of us, it's a davar pasha, we have a neshama, right? What kind of discussion is there? And it's something that we're positive about. So he says, if we could just take that, it is that, therefore, which reflecting back on oneself makes one comprehend the real existence of something else, really, which is invisible and intangible, and by the certainty of the conviction of one's own self, comprehend the conviction of the existence, the conviction of God. As sure as we are of the existence of our own self, so are we of the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it's a very, very important issue. In other words, Rav Hirsch says, if you believe in your own neshama, if you understand and recognize that you have a neshama within you, that is a conduit to being able to believe in a being such as HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not coincidental that atheists have targeted belief in the neshama as a key element to proving their case and to arguing for atheism. If they could disqualify the neshama, then it's into them ammunition, an attack on the chas v'shalom, the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And they labeled it, the term for this philosophy, the philosophy that we don't have a neshama, that all we are is a product of our DNA, a physical, mechanistic being. It's called reductive materialism. They have this extremist view that all we are is a bunch of parts, physical parts, and all that means. And what it means, if you turn to the next page, is quite a few things. But first, I want to start with why I got into this originally and why I sought out my brother very, very avidly, the neurologist, to help me tackle this from a certain viewpoint. I was fortunate to have as a mentor in medicine, in cardiology, one of the premier cardiologists in the country, pediatric cardiologist. He was really top of his field, of our field. And I was fortunate, he kind of took me under his wing, and I had a very close relationship with him. And we used to, I used to round on all his patients with him, and I saw all his patients for him. He really taught me everything I know, and my whole clinical approach to my field in medicine comes from this individual. Brilliant person, Jewish, but a complete, absolute atheist. He just didn't believe. And constantly, he knew I was religious, obviously. I wore a yarmulke. I kind of carry myself in a religious way. And he would constantly shepherd me. They would constantly chide me. You're so rational when it comes to medicine. How could you be so irrational when it comes to religion? So I would say, yeah, I was thinking the same thing about you, right? What's with you? And we used to go back and forth. And then one day he sat me down and he said, we need to have a talk. Now, I'm not sure if he was having some spiritual crisis at the time. It crossed my mind. But he really wanted, he was all business most of the time. But this time he wanted to sit down and discuss with me my beliefs. So he sits me down and he said, what do you believe? What do you believe happens after we, Me'av Esrim, he didn't say that, but after people die, what do you think happens? So I said, I believe the soul survives the body. The soul goes on. He says, you really believe that? So I go, what do you believe? So you see on this page, it says the word tape recorder towards the bottom right. He said to me, I'll never forget it. So first time I heard someone really voice this opinion. He goes, I think it's like a tape recorder. Now, some of the younger guys don't know what a tape recorder is. Tape recorder is this thing with a reel, and when the reel's done, what happens? The tape recorder clicks off. And I'll never forget that. He goes like that to me. I go, that's what you believe? Boy, I'd be very depressed if I really believe that, but I really don't. And then he started to espouse this reductive materialistic view. And I said, I think that's crazy. And he said, I think you're crazy. So I said, okay, good. So we're a bunch of crazies. Where are we going to go from here? So I said, I want to discuss this from two perspectives. The one he was not interested in was the one I was more interested in. That's Chazal, which we're going to do. What does Chazal have to say about this issue? I have enough confidence, Baruch Hashem, not that they need my haskamos, in Chazal, that what they tell me about the neshama, that's what's good enough for me. But it was certainly not going to be good enough for him. And this is how things evolved. But before we get why this is such a critical issue, is I want you to see one of the leading advocates for reductive materialism. It's rishus to me, somebody who espouses this idea confidently, without doubt, was Sir Francis Crick. Who knows who that was? Right? The double helix of DNA. He was a very famous Nobel Prize winning biologist. So he said the following. It's on the top of this page. He wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis. And in it, it was all about this concept. He writes that we all have to realize that you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity, free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and the associated molecules. Unbelievable. All we really are, right? Our feelings, our thoughts, everything is just that. So who cares what they believe if we have confidence in our Masorah, which is really where I was coming from in my discussions with this doctor. But where does it lead if that gets to be society's belief? If society believed what Francis Crick is saying, so look what he himself writes as a natural consequence of his belief. It's where the arrow is on the bottom. Dr. Crick inferred that we cannot continue to regard all human life as sacred. We believe in Kedushas HaChaim, Kedushas HaNeshama. If there's a neshama, there's Kedusha. If there's a neshama, there's more to a human being than just a material object. There's Kedusha. But if you don't believe in it, there's no Kedushas HaChaim. There's nothing. So he says like this. Actually, you can read it on your own. I don't want to get bogged down in reading too much. I'll summarize what he says. He comes up with the following approach. Society, he's suggesting society pick this up. Let's arbitrarily define the beginning and the ending of life. Because if it's not having any Kedusha, if there's nothing sacred about life, so then let's be practical. So he says like this, we're going to define life as begins 72 hours, 3 days. After 3 days, that's when life begins. Nothing about abortion. We're not talking fetus. We're outside the womb, right? After birth. You got 72 hours. What's he getting at? So if you read what he wrote, you can read it on your own. You know what he's getting at? We can remove all the defectives. If somebody is not what society needs, right? Talk about eugenics. It's unbelievable. If you know, then they're not, it's not killing if we get rid of them because they're not alive yet. And what about at the other end? What about at the other end of life? So he at least he picked a relatively late number. I wasn't sure what he was going to do. He lives in England where there's like socialized medicine and very scarce medical resources. So he says we're going to arbitrarily decide that life ends at age 80. What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is no one older than 80 gets to use any of the medical resources that are available. They have to give it up. And if they're on a dialysis machine, they got to unhook themselves, right? And give it over to the people under 80 because at 80, you're no longer alive by his arbitrary definition. That's where this ugly, ugly philosophical approach takes you. Now, it's interesting, just as an aside, he lived, I think, to the age 88, correct. And my brother had a mentor who he did research with, who was a student of Crick and knew him very well. And when he hit 80, he used all the medical resources available and continued to use them all the way up to 88. So he was a hypocrite as well as a maniac with crazy ideas. Bottom line is, this issue is very, very significant. Rav Hirsch tells me, Emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu is connected to this. There's a kesher between believing in your own neshama and shmartem el nafsho sechem. According to Rav Hirsch, is a CBY for us to be fighting this erroneous idea. So how are we going to do it? So if you turn the page, this is the beginning of my conversation with my mentor, who I decided I'm going to share a Gemara with. Right? So there's a famous Gemara that's quoted often, Shalom Zachars, and very, very often in other contexts, at a bris milah. It's the Gemara Nida that says, if it says, Shlosha Shutvim, there are three partners in the creation of every human being, right? There's the mother and the father, each gives a component of the DNA in Chazal's language. That's what they're saying, right? The father gives this, the mother gives this, and then Kadosh Baruch Hu, nosin bo ruach neshama klaster panim re'iyas ha'ayin shmiyas ha'ozen dibor peh, goes through a whole list. That whole list I translated for my mentor, and I said, we believe, if you want to know what does an Orthodox Jew believe in terms of what makes up a human being, so we know about DNA, right? Father, mother, but that's only the guf. There's another component. We're dualists. We believe in a duality. We believe that there's body, there's guf, and neshama. And the neshama is something coming directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what does it cover? And here's where I fell into his trap. The neshama covers cluster panim, personality, countenance, sight, vision, motor function, awareness, all these attributes. So he goes, gotcha, like that. How did he get me? So everybody who goes through medical school basically gets exposed to very interesting findings, contemporary neurological findings, that most of the things on that list, from a certain perspective, are things that are clearly coming out of the brain, out of the very physical brain. So he starts to say like this. He says, let's go through your list. Personality, you said, that's something that we're getting from the neshama. So neshama is involved in our character, was what we had said, midos. It's something that our neshamas are in charge of. So he said, what are you talking about? Didn't you ever hear of? Everybody knows this, Phineas Gage, right? Anyone who took a high school or a college psych course gets introduced to Phineas Gage. Who was Phineas Gage? Phineas Gage was the guy who was working on the railroad, and he was a mensch. He was known as a nice person, very, very polite, whatever, good guy. And then he made a mistake by hammering into gunpowder and got a metal rod right through his head. You see, I think on this page is his skull, it's in Harvard Medical School, they still have it. This rod went right up through the orbit, through his brain, but in a non-fatal way. So he survived it, but it hit the frontal lobe of his brain, and his personality changed. And this is what they indoctrinate unsuspecting high school and college psych introducers to the idea that you see personality, midos, it's all there in the brain. It has nothing to do with any kind of spirituality. So he said, number one, Phineas Gage, right? We'll see what we could do with that. Then he says, vision. If somebody has a occipital lobe, that's the lobe in the brain that handles vision, and has lo aleinu, a stroke there, a CBY there, and knocks out the whole thing, they could be totally blind and not realize they're totally blind. They think they could see, but they're totally blind. Why? Because vision is in the brain. And he does the same thing with hearing and speech and language. He says they've mapped certain aphasias. There are certain very specific types of speech defects that people have that are very particular. One's vocabulary, one's grammar, and all these things are mapped out according to certain lesions in the brain. And he's like getting all excited as he's telling me what he thinks is going to make me into an atheist, right? So he has very interesting cognitive abilities, intellect, consciousness. He says, even that's in the brain. I go, what do you mean? So he says, there's a dominant and a non-dominant hemisphere. When I talked about this once in Nicholas, I wanted to demonstrate for them this. So there's a very famous way to separate the two halves of the brain. And I meant to put it together and maybe call you, Yehuda, to demonstrate, but I didn't. What you could do is if you write down a bunch of colors, right, on a piece of paper, and you write red, orange, green, blue, whatever, all the different colors, and then you color them a different color than the word. And you ask somebody to read it based on color, so they're going to be very prodding and slow, because that's the non-dominant hemisphere of the brain. But if you ask them to read the words, they can read it very fast. So that's like doing brain surgery, right? I separated the two halves of the brain. But he was telling me, don't you know that experiment? I go, yeah, I know that experiment. He says, doesn't that prove even color recognition, creativity, artistic talent, that's all in the non-dominant hemisphere. Cognition, reading, that's all in the dominant hemisphere. V'chule, v'chule. So he thinks he's got it. So I want to pause on his arguments. And I put this warning out when I did this topic in Mechala. And all the girls are getting very nervous when we got to this point in this discussion, because they're thinking, wow, he won. He proved it. Now we got to know neshama. So what's going on, Rabbi Apfel? What are you doing to us? You're making us all tapi korsim. I said, no one's allowed to leave. No, and we went a little late that day, but I had to finish the whole thing. So I'm going to say the same thing now. Nobody can leave, or at least listen to it or something. I'm going to respond to all his arguments. And he wasn't being his usually intellectually honest self in throwing out the arguments the way he did. And I'm going to complete it. But I want to emphasize so much that to me, Chazal is more important. And if I have so much confidence in Chazal, that if Chazal gives me a theory and understanding of neshama and guf, that's what I'm most interested in. So that's what I want to start with. We're going to do that first. So start with the following on page 3. How does a person come to be a person, right? A person's made up of a guf and a neshama. How does that happen? Where does it all begin? So we all know it, begins at fertilization. That's where people begin, right? And when is it that, let's say, there is a completion of the human being physically, where the rest is going to be just somatic growth, right? But all his organs are in place. When is a vlad? So everyone knows 40 days, right? Prior to 40 days, it's called Maya Ba'alma. But at 40 days, and Chazal did very well with this, right? If you're into these kind of things, this is one of the discovery, I think, rayas, that, something that wasn't really understood till the 20th century in terms of embryology and fetal development was something Chazal were all over when they said 40 days. Because really, the way fetuses are formed is there's an embryonic stage and then a fetal stage, which begins right around that time. So a human being is physically formed at 40 days. Okay. But that's all the DNA. That's the body, right? That's the contribution from the mother, contribution from the father, fertilized, zygote. The zygote starts to develop into an embryo once it's implanted, and then it becomes a fetus. What's the big shaila? What about the neshama? When is it, according to Chazal, that the neshama enters the body? That's our opening question, right? 40 days or earlier? Who asked this shaila? Antoninus, right? Very famous Gemara on the bottom over there in Sanhedrin. There's a whole series of shailas. Antoninus was Marcus Aurelius, right? He became friendly with Rabbi, Yehuda Anasi, and there's a whole series of shailas that he's asking Rabbi. So one of the shailas was this exact shaila. The Gemara says, Amar le Antoninus le Rabbi, neshama me'emasai nisna ba'adam, mishas pekida or mishas yitzir. So he wanted to know, is it at the moment of conception, or does the neshama enter at that 40-day period when we have a fully formed fetus? That's his shaila. So Rebbe says, Shas Yitzira. Shas Yitzira. So says Antoninus, Shas Yitzira. How can it be? What's going on until then? It's like having meat that's unsalted. That's the analogy he uses. He said, if you don't have the neshama, that DNA product can't make it to 40 days. It must be from Shas Pekida. Says Rebbe, you know what? You're right. And he brings a puzzle to back him up. Antoninus got it right. So according to the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Befeirosh, when does the neshama enter the body for the first time? 40 days. 40 days. If you turn the page, there's a stira. There is another Gemara. This Gemara is talking about how we can't live without Torah, which of course is true. There is no life. If the real Shmiras HaNefesh is Torah. So the Gemara is learning it from various ways. So comes Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. They both said, Torah nitana ba'arba'im, the neshama nitna ba'arba'im. He says, we had to have Torah when we had our neshama. One without the other, you can't last. Your neshama can't last without Torah. That was the sort of point of the Gemara. But the Gemara is saying, what befeirosh? When does the neshama come in? 40 days. Not Shas Pekida. According to the other Gemara, the neshama has to come in right at the beginning. According to this Gemara, no, it doesn't come in until 40 days. Very straightforward stira. So how do we reconcile it? So we reconcile it with what's a very fascinating approach that all the Rishonim and all the Achronim discuss when they talk about neshamas. The neshama is a very complex being. The neshama has basically 3 subtypes or 3 chalakim. Everybody's neshama has nefesh hatzamachas, which is like plants even have. A plant has nefesh tzamachas, the ability to grow. Nefesh behenis and nefesh chionis, which means it's animation. It means that there's a circulation, there's life, there's biological life. All animals have it. Of course, human beings have it. And then there's something that's unique to human beings. That's the third component. So all these things are not necessarily coming in at the same time. It could be that the chiyus comes in, Shas Pekida, like Antoninus was saying. And then a different component of the neshama comes in, like Tzamachas at Yitzira, v'chuli, v'chuli. It's a whole complicated thing. The Rishonim actually discussed this in very interesting ways, where exactly there's the location of these different parts of the neshama. It's interesting. I remember, I think I told you guys this story. I once heard the most incredible thing about the nefesh hatzamachas, the plants. It really is a tangential story, but I don't know, it's something to think about. I had for Shabbos, I had a former patient of mine over for Shabbos, and he had been through a lot of serious surgery, and I said to him, and he'd gotten very close to his roommate. He had someone in his room, a not Jewish boy with the same problem he had. They both went through the same surgery, and the families got very close. He was a very yeshivish guy, very yeshivish family. I think they were from Borough Park. And this Bensonhurst Italian family. It was just very interesting dynamic. And they both were going through something together, so they got close. So I asked him, did you ever how's he doing? Are you staying in touch? So he told me, oh, unfortunately, he passed away, the boy. So I said, oh, wow, I'm so sorry to hear that. Did you pay your respects? Did you go to the funeral? What did you do? He said, well, I was going to, but my Rabbi told me it was Bittul Torah. I said, he did? Really? That's Bittul Torah. Like, I didn't want to start up with him, but like always Rabbi. But I don't know. I questioned him. He said, no, I see you're bothered. He said, no, he told me that they're just plants. Right? So I said, what? I wasn't holding a nefesh somacha so much at that time, but I mean, like, plants? Usually they'll say at least behemoths, but plant, unbelievable. But I think all human beings have all three of these halakim, and including Jew and non-Jew. Everybody has all three of these components. Question is now, where are they located? Where is the neshama? Right? So very fascinating discussion in Rishonim there. The Ibn Ezra, Kedarko, has like a very sort of almost logical kind of svara. He says, well, the nefesh samachas, which is growth, that's in the liver. The liver has a lot to do with metabolism and growth. And he says the chiyus and the behemoth, that's in the heart, and the chelik of kamimal is in the brain. Right? There's all sorts of theories. It's all speculation. It's based on Kabbalah and various sources like that. The Gra had an amazing idea. The Vilna Gaon's take was the neshama is really upstairs, and we're just like acting out the neshama long distance. It's a very fascinating, I have no idea what it means, kind of approach. But I think the mainstream view is Gemara and Brachos and Daf Yud is talking about a comparison. There's certain ways where human beings are compared to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, certain similarities. One of them is the following. The way HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Malei Kol HaOlam Kulo, that's how the Neshama is Malei Kol HaGuf Kulo. So this is the mainstream view. Rav Aaron Soloveitchik once wrote, after he had a stroke, he wrote an incredible piece on his experience with having a stroke and how he used to believe in the Neshama based on Emunah's Chachamim, Emunah in his Masorah. He says now he experienced it, right, through his stroke. But the bottom line is, this is the mainstream view, is it's throughout that. So what does that mean exactly? It's in what sense? So Rav Sa'adja, over here on the bottom of page 4, he says, but in truth, the main manifestation of the neshama and its main location to some degree is in the mind, And he thinks that it has to be that because the mind, and what does he mean by the mind as distinct from the brain? The brain is a physical entity, right? And the mind is something that is not a physical entity. The mind is consciousness. The mind is deductive reasoning and logic and calculating and intellectual pursuits. That's what he means by the mind. He says that's where the neshama is. So this is exactly what my friend, the cardiologist mentor, attacks. He says, you can't tell me that the calculations and the various attributes of the mind are the neshama, because we can label it, we can find exactly where in the brain it is taking place. So along comes, not in response to that argument, but on his own, on page 6. This is from the Alter Rebbe, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, Shneur Zalman. He got into this topic very heavily, and he writes, no, even the mind, like the brain itself, is not the neshama. The neshama is separate, and here's where we're going to get to really the essence of Chazal's take on neshamos and the way we should approach practically what our neshamas are doing. He says the neshama uses the brain like a kli and the mind like a kli. All those things that vision, hearing, the creative thinking, language, all of these things, they are kelim, right? They're facilitated by the brain, and they are not the neshama. The neshama is a separate entity. So it's a very abstract idea. What's he talking about? Like it's very hard to understand him. He's quoting, if you read it, we don't have time to read it, but if you read it, he brings rayas. For example, he says, the neshama doesn't age. The neshama is something that doesn't really change on its own. It's a constant. And yet we see our intellects change very much from being an infant to being a mature adult, from being an adolescent to being an adult, from being a child to being an adolescent, where there's a constant change and evolution of our intellects, of our basic cognitive approach. And how's that happening? Because that's happening to our physical selves. But the neshama is constant. Yes. The brain is the physical entity that's within our skulls, right? And it has, to quote my brother, the consistency of toothpaste. It's like a physical entity that's like mushy, I guess, right? The mind is the functions of the brain, right? What the brain is doing. It's more the pa'ulos. But what Shneur Zalman is trying to emphasize somehow is it's still a kli used, even the mind, meaning the calculations I make, right? The logic that I derive, the deductions, all of that is somehow a kli for the neshama. It's a very hard concept to understand until you get to the next page. And this really opened it up for me. Is something, of all places, Rav Chaim Shmulevitz and Sichos Musar, and Rav Dessler and Michtav Eliyahu, they give the most beautiful, I finally understood, I think, what Rav Shneur Zalman's driving at, and what Chazal are driving at, through their explanation. So you can see it, I brought it, so you can see it one day inside. I want to say it outside. It's a very, very important idea that they're conveying. This
is why if you're brain dead, you still have the neshama.
Very, very well could be, yes. In other words, the fact that the neshama is distinct from the entire body, 100%. But coming back to what they say in the following, starts off where Shmulevitz makes the following point. He says, we all know that the neshama, that chelik elokei mimah, the way Chazal describe it, knows everything. It knows kol haTorah kula, right? To quote him, he says, Yodea who is kol haTorah kula, the afzeh below amel v'yageya, without having to learn. It just knows it. It's fed to it. V'hu sofa umabit misofa olam v'atsofa. He's quoting Gemaras. He's saying, and it's known that the neshama in utero, the neshama knows all. Why? Because it's a chelik elokei mimah. So what happens? What's the famous next line in this Gemara? The malach comes. And the malach is the thing that makes us not know everything anymore, our neshamas. So Rav Shmulevitz leaves it metaphysical, right? He leaves it right here. He says, this is going to make for great drushos one day at Meisham Zachars, right? He's in Avelus over the lost Torah, the Chule, and all the very, very famous ideas. But he's looking for Musa. So Rabbi Shmulevitz says, my take on that Gemara is it's trying to say the ideas that we need to acquire Torah through Amelus, right? That's what we're emphasizing, which is entirely true. But Rav Dessler takes it to a different height, is the way I'm going to put it. Rav Dessler says, no, what is this malach touching us and making us forget allegorical? And what is it representing? Says Rav Dessler, it represents the fact that neshama, that pure, unbelievable emanation from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or creation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whichever it is, that Tzelem Elokim is put into the guf and limited by the guf. The tapping of the malach on our lips, or whatever's going on over there, represents the fact that our neshamas are held in check by the guf, the kli that they're given. And he says it like this, on the one hand, a neshama, which is a purely spiritual being, how does it interact in this very material world? How can a neshama possibly interact? It needs to be within combination with a guf. But at the same time, while that's happening, for purposes of Hashem's Ratzon, it is limited there. What does that mean, limited? It means that it depends on your Kli, what your neshama is going to be able to do. So, for example, I remember when I was a counselor in Camp Hask many, many years ago. So I was very sensitive, right? It was quite an experience for me. I just felt very bad for a lot of the campers. And I went to one of the rabbis in the camp, and I said, "Can you just explain to me, why did Hashem allow for this? Why did Hashem create them?" So he gave me what I considered the worst answer I've ever heard. He said, "Well, for you. So you could like do mitzvahs and you could do chesed." And I said, "Wow, not appealing to me. I don't like it. I don't like it enough. There's got to be something better." So you know who taught me something better? Unbelievable, and I want to give her credit because she really, really put me in my place. Rebbitzin Kamenetsky, Shmuel Kamenetsky's Rebbitzin, Aleha Shalom. Really, anyone who had discussed to meet her, she's a very incredible person. She has a problem with the vaccines. That's a side issue. But in terms of her elevated status as a Jew, unbelievable. How did I find out? So I had one of her children was my camper, and he had Down syndrome. He was, I would say, just a coincidence, but he was the smartest Down syndrome kid I've ever seen in my life. And the first day when she introduces me to him, the very first day at camp, I'll never forget this. She says, by the way, here's what he needs to have. Every night you got to tell him a Gedolim story, right? Tell him a story about one of the Gedolim. And also make sure he does his learning, and then make sure he does chesed. So I'm like, really? Okay, that sounds interesting. So the first night, I get up there, right? And he already, within 1 or 2 days, had the whole bunk under his control. He was like the leader of this whole chevra. So he has them doing whatever he says. So the first night, I'm saying, "Okay, guys, if you get into bed, I'm going to give you a Gedolim story," right? So he starts screaming, "No, Batman, no Gedolim stories." So I saw that it wasn't, going to be that pashut to do all the things that Rebbe and Kamenetsky had asked me to do. So my goal became, instead of the learning and instead of the midos, was to get him to brush his teeth, to get him to have better hygiene, those kind of goals. So comes visiting day. She comes over to me, and I'm thinking, I was reasonable. And she says, "All right, how's his midos? How's this hasmada?" I am not joking. Those are the exact words. How is midos and how's this hasmada? So I'm like looking at her, I go, "I'm really sorry, but I thought it would be important for me to teach him this hygienic habit and this hygienic habit. And that really is what I worked on." And she gave it to me. She said, why are you limiting his neshama? Right? What right do I have to put a seal on what his neshama could do? He says, because, and she didn't quote Rav Dessler, but Rav Dessler really gives her voice. She was saying, you know how it works? We all have neshamas. They're full of kedusha on neshamas. They're limitless in their potential. But Hashem puts each and every one of us into a certain kli. And that kli, we have to do whatever we can to maximize the accomplishments of our neshamos with the kli we were given. So he was given that kli. Who says he can't do X, Y, and Z? And she really hammered it home. And then I realized, what do you mean? Why did Hashem allow for somebody to have Down syndrome? Why? What do you mean? That's an neshama in that kli, and that neshama could be accomplishing 1,000 times more than I am. I think I'm accomplishing things, but in my kli, there's a certain expectation. In his kli, there's a different expectation. It could be that his neshama is accomplishing more. And that was the yesod she said, and I think it's exactly, she was miskavenes to Rav Dessler. That is what Rav Dessler says. That is basically the idea. Now, he takes it one step further than Rav Dessler. And he says, okay, so this is all the neshama operating through the kalim, right? And if a person's blind, lo aleinu, or deaf, that's their kli. And if a person is handicapped and paralyzed, lo aleinu, in some other way, that's their kli. And that's one thing. But where do we see maybe some expressions and manifestations of our neshamos independent of the guf? Do we ever see the neshama? That's the title of one of his mechtavim Mal peulos hanefesh bilti tluyos baguf. So Rav Dessler got into this, and he came up with some interesting ideas. I haven't verified, his suggestions, but I'll tell you what they were. He said, we see the neshama acting out on its own when we go to sleep. And what does he say? He says he knows of people that they went to sleep and they said, okay, I need to wake up. I don't know if anyone could attest or verify this in their own personal experience. But if you say to yourself, all right, I'm going to sleep right now, I'm going to wake up at 3 a.m. And then they just wake up at 3 a.m. because the neshama does it, right? So I don't know, it needs independent scientific verification if you need those kind of things. Then he says, another one is, there's a problem you're working on all day, a sugya in the Gemara. You're trying to get down the lumdus of something, right? And you just can't crack it. You can't do it. Then you go to sleep, right? And you wake up and you got it. Or you have some moment of inspiration. He says that's the neshama. That's the neshama. And then he gave one final raya, which I'm going to come back to, because it's one of my arguments I used on my friend, the doctor, right? He quotes from this very famous neurosurgical experiment. I was amazed that Rav Dessler was holding in this, but he was. And that's his third raya. The one I think that covers it for me a little smoother is Rav Soloveitchik. Because Rav Soloveitchik tackles this exact same issue. And that's on the next page. And Rav Soloveitchik, the context in which Rav Soloveitchik was speaking was the question that really always bothered me. You know how people say there's a question that bothered me for years, and they just use it as a vehicle in a shiur? Well, this one actually really always bothered me, right? Nasev and Ishma. We are so lauded for Nasev and Ishma. And I always said, why is Nasev and Ishma a good thing? That's smart. Do and then understand. Do and then we will hear. Right. So it's about bitachon and trusting HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who did all those great things, but it doesn't seem like a good approach to life. Do and then understand. Right? It's like, I'm going to invest $5 million in this company and then I'll find out about it. That doesn't seem like a prudent way to approach life. So the Rav asked this kasha, right? What was so great about Nasev and Ishma? Why does it make sense to somebody who's used to using logic and svara to understand things and make decisions? So he says the following, and he's talking here about the neshama on its own. We are therefore inclined to follow the masters of Kabbalah, who taught that not man's rationality, but his ratzon elyon, his higher will, constitutes the singular endowment which distinguishes him from the rest of creation. This will, that ratzon elyon, makes decisions without consulting the intellect. It doesn't consult the brain and it doesn't consult the mind. The intellect is the mind. This is separate from the mind, separate from the brain. It is a ratzon elyon. It is lamala from the intellect. And it is something that it is the center of the spiritual personality. It's the neshama. It constitutes man's real identity, man's pragmatic intellect, which weighs pros and cons. When we use our brains and we're weighing risk-benefit, we're weighing pluses and minuses of an issue, so that's using the ratzon tachton. That's the lower intellect. That's the kli. Whatever the kli could do, that's what we could do. We're bound and limited by what our kli can do. Some people have super brains. Okay, that's a big advantage. Most of us have average brains. So we don't have that type of advantage. But when it comes to the major decisions in life, says Rav Soloveitchik, all the major ones, who I should marry, what career should I pursue, where should I live, all these major decisions, he says that's coming from your ratzon elyon. If you think about it, he starts proving it by saying Einstein did it, and this one, and that one. But I thought back on myself. At the end of the day, there is an intuitive decision that you make. You will then double check with your logic. We all use both. But the ultimate decision very often can't be decided by that slow process of weighing pros and cons. It says Rav Soloveitchik, you know where that decision is coming from? That's our neshamos. That is our ratzon elyon. That is the ultimate real us that's making that decision. And with that, and on the bottom, Rav Olby has a very similar idea. Anu chayavim lahotzi el hapoel hakochos ha-tamirim ha-misharshim banu mitzad mishmasenu. V'tzadik hu amotzi kochosa b'tovim elapoim. A tzaddik is a person who's able to tap into the kedusha and greatness of their neshama, and it's expressed in the decisions they make. And therefore, our guf will tempt us. There's a Yetzer Hara that comes in. Al pi Kabbalah, the Yetzer Hara comes in around bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah time. That's another part that we have to deal with, right? But at the end of the day, our choices, our decisions, that's coming from the neshama, using the Ratzon Elyon and using the Ratzon Tov. So this is really Chazal's take, putting it all together in terms of what a neshama does. But none of this would have meant a thing to my mentor, right? I could not approach him with my basic belief in my Masorah, belief in Chazal, right? He would start asking me, where does that come from? Why should I believe Chazal? Why should I believe the Talmud? So how do you explain to someone, well, you spend years and years learning it, and you are so impressed by its brilliance, by its moral heights, and you come to want to just, swallow all you can, that gives you a certain confidence in Chazal. But that's not where he's ever going to come from. He's only going to come from his scientific understanding and experimentation. So what is the response to the rayas that he had brought? So the first one is very fascinating. There is a famous neurosurgeon, to those that are following neurosurgeons, by the name of Wilder Penfield. Anyone have heard of him? All right. Okay, there we go. Got one. Who is Wilder Penfield? He was a Canadian neurosurgeon, one of the top. Anyone ever hear of homunculus? Right? Okay, good. You're a neurologist?
Psychiatrist.
Oh, psychiatrist. Oh, that's even better. So he's very famous in the world of psychiatry and neurology. So he was a firm materialist, like my doctor friend. Didn't believe in a duality. He believed that we're all just machines. We're all DNA. And he set out to prove it. So how did he do it? His specialty was intractable epilepsy, which lo aleinu means somebody who can't have their seizures treated. The seizures just keep going no matter what medication you use. So what he's operating, let's say, in the 20th century, early 20th century, and mid 20th century. What do? So you do surgery. They would try to remove the focus of the seizure. So he's operating on about thousands of brains doing this, and he has access to all these brains. Now, when you operate on, anyone ever operate on the brain? No. Okay, so when a person, Henry? Yes. So when you operate on the brain, one of the fascinating things about it is the brain does not have pain receptors itself. You can actually keep the person awake. You just give local anesthetic, and then you keep them awake because you want to know, while you're operating, are you paralyzing them? Chas v'shalom? Are you doing something to hurt them? So you want them to be able to speak. So he had this great opportunity. He's going to prove, and what did he set out to prove? Reductive materialism. He's going to prove that all we are is, a product of what our brain is telling us to do. We move because that's some kind of neuronal synapse that's leading to movement. So he started doing experiments. It's hard for us to imagine this, but he had the person's skull off and access to the brain. He would do the following. He would stimulate a part of the brain, and that was, let's say it was the visual part. The person would see a flash of light. He would stimulate the part of the brain that makes your arm move, and it would make his arm move. And he started to ask them, what's happening to you, right? Comparing when I'm making you move to when you move it yourself. And during the surgery, he would say, all right, move your arm. And then he would do it. Doesn't that feel the same? Because that would prove his point, right? We think we're moving our arms, but it's really just some mechanistic thing going on in our brains. So what did he get shocked to find out? The opposite. Everyone said that you're doing it, I'm not doing it. And this happened repeatedly in various forms. He had them speaking, right? As opposed to they themselves deciding to speak. And based on this and a couple of other rayas, he wrote a book on this, he changed his mind. And he became a believer in duality. A very vocal and avid believer in duality. He became one of the biggest spokespeople. So when it comes to that was a very big, kind of raya that it's something else within us that is operating and using the brain as a kli, using the brain as an instrument to either move our limbs or to speak or to see. All these things are in the back, the sources. I wanted everyone to see it inside. On page 11, Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage, to me, is one of the greatest rayas for Abdesla. Why? If you look, and you could look in Wikipedia or Google it yourselves, I checked today to see what those sources would say about this, because I was getting it from other sources. And sometimes you get like politics involved, and you never know what you're going to get. But it's safe to Google, because Google was honest. And I was very happy that they were honest about this. They said that the latest understanding of Phineas Gage is he became nice again. He had a kli. The kli got messed up. So it affected him in whatever way. First of all, if I got shot with an iron thing through my head, I wouldn't be such a happy guy either. But either way, he changed. He was able to do what Reb Desser says we're chayiv to do. And what Rebbetzin Kamenetsky told me, we're all chayiv to do. We're chayiv to take our kli, whatever the condition of the kli is, and make it good. Our neshamas are good and holy. And we need that to be the objective. And Phineas Gage did it. Phineas Gage had a messed up kli. I don't know what frontal lobe destruction really does to a personality, but if it does cause harm to the personality, we still have our neshama that's able to overcome that challenge and become nice again. And all the later literature on him, which is some reason left out of these socially biased psych books, right, says that he actually was chozer b'tshuva and he became a good guy again. I think that's a very, very compelling understanding. And then, of all people, personality-wise, it's interesting. Rav Sternbach has a very interesting take of right? I tell this to the guys every year before Purim. Make sure everybody's kavanos are proper. Rav Sternbach says, that he says Yom Kippurim, Purim, is the big test day. Why? Because you see what a person's really made of, right? Where's your neshama holding? It's almost like the neshama has a test there, because when we have our full faculties and we're not demented or we're not drunk, so we could control ourselves. And we might not be seeing the real us yet, or where the real us is at that point in time. But you take it away, you disinhibit with either drinking, as Rav Sternbach points out, or with, like you're alluding to, that a person who has dementia, just to illustrate this, there's a story I always tell, I hope it's okay. I'll leave it anonymous. There's a certain Rebbetzin in this neighborhood. She lost her mother. She was having nicham avelim, and it was like a conveyor belt. Everybody their house has a door on the left side and a door on the right side, and you had about a minute to speak to her, to be menachem avil, because there were so many people lining up to see her. And I remember thinking, I was online, and I'm thinking to myself, what am I going to say? I got my 1 minute. What's the best nicham avelim I could do? So you're supposed to be, when you're menachem avil, you're supposed to talk about the niftaris. So I said, all right, I'm going to ask her, what was the most inspiring? Her mother was an incredible woman. What was the most inspiring thing she did that really inspired you? So she said, it was last week. So I had visited the previous week, and she was having problems of, totally being out of it. And what is she talking about? So I said, what do you mean? What do you mean last week? She was completely, I wouldn't say demented, but she was out of it. So she said, well, I visited many people in that condition. And many of them, what happens when they are disinhibited, when that part of the brain is not holding them in check, the bad parts of their past come out. Like they'll start cursing, there'll be nivel pad, there'll be, not nice, anger, screaming, personality change. And my mother, she said, when she was in that state, she said Tehillim, she said Divrei Torah, she said, beautiful, beautiful things. And to me, that was the greatest representation of who be'etzem she really was, what kind of person she really was. And that's the idea. Be'etzem, we got to get, that's what Volby is saying in Alei Shor. He's saying, this is the striving in life, is whatever the kli we were given, whatever the circumstances we're given, whatever condition we're in. It's a striving, even if you have Downs, even if someone has Down syndrome, it's that neshama to achieve as much goodness as it possibly can. I want to just go back with two more counter arguments to my friend, the doctor. This is a very interesting source. Noam Chomsky, we all know Noam Chomsky's now. We're not all big fans of his necessarily, right? He's not been a big friend of Israel, that's for sure. And he has whatever. But he had a fascinating, what was he really known for? He's a linguist. And that was his fame. That was his degree. That's why he was the professor. That's why he was such an important person. I don't really think he had rights to, dictate politics to anybody, but in linguistics, we'll give him his due. So what's one of his most famous discoveries here on page 12 is the creative aspect of language use. What is that? It is our ability to go beyond vocabulary, go beyond grammar, and speak in the abstract. Speak about things we've never encountered. Have an imagination and then express in words those things that are words that are expressive of ideas that be never exposed to. He says, grammar, for sure, there's a part of the brain that is involved in grammar. Vocabulary, for sure, but this creative language has no physical source. And he's basically saying, I want to say to him, no. So it sounds like you believe in a neshama, because where else is it coming from? If you believe in a neshama, maybe you should be a little more friendly to your people, but whatever. I'll save my editorializing for another time. Finally, the one that I find the most appealing, page 13 and 14 here, is the other thing that no scientist has ever come close to mapping in any type of scientific study is something called qualia. What is that? It is how I feel when I see, I love chocolate, right? I love it. So I have a subjective experience when I see it. That is something unique to me that is not locatable. That qualitative, subjective experience of chocolate to me, or let's say certain colors, the way on page 13, consider your visual experience as you stare at a bright turquoise color patch in a paint store. There's something it is like for you subjectively to undergo that experience. And it's very different from what it is for someone else, or for you, a dull brown color patch. The way I react to a dull brown color patch is different, but everything mechanistically it's working through my retina, and I'm appreciating the color, and there's a reflection of light. I give you a whole scientific explanation, and it goes back to the optic nerve, and then to my occipital part of my brain. All of that. That could be all explained by the kli called the brain, but the qualitative, conscious experience of it, how it means something to me, how it means something to me in an emotional event, it's very unique. And there is a book called The Soul Hypothesis, which I highly recommend. It is a serious academic work. It is not like one of these things they get ripped apart by serious academics, because it's all very serious academics themselves. They went in on various disciplines to try to test this hypothesis. Do we have a soul or don't we have a soul? That's where these paragraphs are coming from. And they overwhelmingly, and on page 14, I have a whole list of some of their final conclusions, favor the idea of a neshama, even on a purely scientific basis, even on a purely experimental basis. So all of this, I recommended that book to my mentor. I don't know if he ever read it, but I hope he did. He seems to be a happier person, so I'm assuming he did. Mm-hmm. I think duality is a much happier way to live. And then I'll end with this, a very famous quote. Some of the people that are on that last page are famous philosophers, neuroscientists. They've all come along to go from extreme materialists to believers in the neshama. So there is a person named Robert Jastrow. Anyone heard of the Jastrow dictionary? Right back in our day, right? Before Art Scroll, we had to do it the hard way, right? Looking up every word, very tedious. So Jastrow had a grandson who was a professor in Columbia, and he was also started as an atheist. And then there was a major upheaval in the scientific world when the Big Bang Theory became accepted. So he gave a very famous quote that I want to apply to this issue of reductive materialism. He said, he says, there we are, we spend our whole lives working, trying to prove scientifically these very secular ideas. And we finally get to the top, right? And he's talking about the Big Bang. And he says, and what do we notice as we get to the top of that mountain? A band of theologians, Rabbanim, I'll say, have been sitting there for centuries. So, so I think that the idea of this is a very common attack mode people get exposed to in college. That's another reason I like to promote this topic. But we have to have confidence really in the part that comes from Chazal. Maybe my mentor needs the scientific counter arguments, and it's nice that they exist. But I think we should have a lot of confidence just in our Masorah. Our Masorah gives a very beautiful understanding of the fact that we have neshamas, where they come from, and what our goal is, and a way to relate to all people of various abilities, and that the neshama is kadosh in every single one of us. Should all be zocheh to perfect our neshamas.
Remember the name of that article about witnessing, right?
It was on Salvation.
Around Salvation.
Yes,
It's